Evening, everyone. Welcome. We'll just give a couple more minutes for the participants to join. So let's just have a couple more minutes.
See, we're losing just not much though, are we? We're just tinkering on the edge.
Hi, everyone. Just another warm welcome for those who just joined. We're just going to give a couple more moments for others to come. And just to let you know, there are about 71 attendees so far. So let's see if more can come. We'll just give them a few moments to join, and then we'll get started.
They were some brutal dead spins there.
Okay. I think
that was the,
we're about ready to go. So hopefully everyone can see me well, can hear me well. Welcome everyone to the Cambridge University Festival and to tonight's event on behalf of the Cambridge University Baha'i Society. Our speaker this evening is Hinton. He studied ethnomusicology at Cambridge University and traveled to Mongolia for studies. He served as Mongolia's first honorary consul general in Australia and is now CEO of the Soros Economic Development Fund. His talk today will be interspersed with stories by Tebi Kutsuwane, Ian MacDonald, and Sarah Percival. After his talk, there will be a few minutes for questions which you can submit via the Q&A feature. So please note that the chat has been disabled and the questions, which will be answered at the very end, you have to submit via the Q&A feature. Ismael Velasco couldn't be with us today, but we would like to acknowledge his major contribution to the story that Ian MacDonald narrates. And in addition to Sean, I'm very delighted that some of our storytellers, Ian and Sarah, are here with us live on the Zoom, but their stories were narrated earlier. It's just over 100 years after the passing of Abdu'l-Baha, and there is a notable Cambridge connection here, as the Orientalist, Professor Edward Granville Browne of Pembroke College, Cambridge, visited Abdu'l-Baha in the year 1890, and he recorded his impressions of that memorable meeting. Now, there is much that could be said about Abdu'l-Baha, and so many stories that could be told. So for this evening, we've chosen just 3 stories, and each story has a British connection. With that in mind, I now warmly welcome Hinton.
Thank you, Zinzan. That's wonderful. And I want to welcome everybody. We have well over 100 who have joined us on this Sunday evening, and we do appreciate your taking the time to join us for this session. And the numbers are continuing to climb, so it's a little hard doing this virtually, knowing when everybody's in the room. So I think we should get going. It's a great privilege to have this opportunity, together with my fellow storytellers, to share with you what we hope will be a portrait of Abdu'l-Baha, who, as the title of our talk says, was a philosopher, a mystic, a social reformer, a promulgator of peace, and really so much more, as I hope we'll be able to offer you in this evening's presentation. 10,000 mourners from every creed and background gathered at Abdu'l-Baha's funeral in 1921 in the city of Haifa to grieve their common loss. He was eulogized as one who had led humanity to the way of truth, as a pillar of peace and the embodiment of glory and greatness. Muslims, Christians, Jews, those of no religious faith, rich and poor, all had come together in love and respect in a rare display of unity. Messages came from all corners of the world. Winston Churchill himself wrote to convey sympathy and condolences. Abdu'l-Baha died having been knighted for his humanitarian services, having traveled from east to west to share the lofty and transformative principles which continue to influence lives and communities around the world today. Having been lauded in the great newspapers of the day for his contributions to peace, and having stewarded the global Baha'i community founded by his father. And yet, he was born in Persia and lived almost his entire life as a prisoner and an exile without material wealth or obvious means of power or influence. So, how did he achieve this? What was the source of his power? And what lessons can we derive today from his example? His story seems to me to offer insights into one of the great mysteries of life that I guess we all face, which is how can we walk a spiritual path with practical feet? And tonight we'll try to answer these questions, not so much by presenting a chronological biography or a formal appreciation, but rather by offering a mosaic of insights from incidents in his life. Abdu'l-Baha was, as the title of the talk suggests, an extraordinary polymath. He had so many roles, from that of philosopher to peacemaker. And yet, the sole title he claimed for himself was that of a servant. So let us start there, with his work in service of others, feeding the hungry and caring for the poor.
We begin this story from the life of Abdu'l-Baha, just before the start of World War I. Much of Abdu'l-Baha's life was spent in exile in the barren prison city of Akka in the Holy Land. When his family was eventually released and moved to Haifa, one of the joys of freedom which he relished was the ability to be back in nature, in the verdant meadows surrounded by flowing streams of the sweetest water. Through his family, some farmland had been acquired on the banks of the Sea of Galilee and in the Jordan Valley. In addition to Abdu'l-Baha's many responsibilities guiding the nascent Baha'i community in the Holy Land and abroad, he had developed an interest in farming and cultivating the recently acquired land. In consultation with local farmers, he instructed them to set aside a portion of the land for the cultivation of food crops such as wheat and corn. In times of need, the food grown on this land would be distributed to individuals and families of all backgrounds and all religions who lived in the local area. Abdu'l-Baha learned from the past, even as he prepared for the future. He used an ancient technique of storing the grains in pits, utilizing structures that had been built by the Romans over 2,000 years ago. The pits were relined and carefully covered, thus ensuring that they were protected from local thieves and, importantly, could store the grain for a long period of time. Just as the world entered the war, Abdu'l-Baha evacuated his family from the city to the nearby Druze village of Abu Sana to ensure their relative safety, although he himself stayed in Haifa to continue his work. After a 6-month absence, and as the hostilities became more routine, his friends and family gradually returned to the city. Of this war, which saddened him deeply, Abdu'l-Baha said, "War is darkness upon darkness, while peace is heavenly light. War is the destroyer of the edifice of mankind, while peace is the everlasting life of the world of humanity." A further calamity struck Haifa during the war when the city was afflicted by a rare plague of locusts. Crops in the area were badly damaged and the yield was decimated. This left the people of Haifa in a fraught and precarious situation, worsened by the fact that they could not receive food aid due to the war. By instituting careful and systematic rationing, and by working closely with women in the local area, Abdu'l-Baha was able to avert a humanitarian disaster, keeping famine at bay by providing those in need with a steady supply of food during the darkest days of the war. Even the British Army was able to benefit from this. While they had been able to rapidly enter the city of Haifa, they had arrived without enough provisions for their soldiers. Thankfully, Abdu'l-Baha had enough food prepared for all. His generosity and foresight was recognized by the British government, and in 1920 he was awarded a knighthood by the governor of Haifa on behalf of His Majesty King Edward. But in accepting this recognition, Abdu'l-Baha demonstrated the deepest humility. It is intriguing that he assented to receiving this honor in the first place. After all, as the promulgator of world peace, mystic and philosopher, this was hardly a title he sought or needed, nor one that would advance him in society in any way. However, as a courtesy and in recognition of the role the British played in bringing peace, he consented to receive this honor. On the day of his investiture, a luxurious chauffeured car was sent round to the home of Abdu'l-Baha to collect him for the ceremony. His long-standing helper, Isfandiar, who would usually have taken to places in Haifa, felt displaced and forlorn that he could not have the honor of accompanying Abdu'l-Baha to the governor's home on such a special occasion. Recognizing this, Abdu'l-Baha signaled to Isfandiar to harness their usual mule-drawn carriage and take him to the side entrance of the governor's home, rather than taking the limousine that had been sent. In doing so, the pomp and ceremony surrounding the investiture and the inevitable fanfare involved was avoided, but nonetheless, Abdu'l-Baha was able to arrive in time for the main event itself and accept the title graciously. For the remainder of his life, Abdu'l-Baha preferred to use this title Servant of Baha rather than the title bestowed by the British of Sir Abbas, KBE. His role as a social reformer was not only recognized by the British, however, but also by the local community of Haifa, and shortly before his passing, he was named as the president of an interfaith civic society for the betterment of the city. Abdu'l-Baha is remembered for feeding the hungry and for caring for the poor and needy, one who never kept anything for himself nor sought any recognition or reward, but rather truly was the servant of humanity.
Abdu'l-Baha's insights into the fundamental principles of social and economic justice remain relevant and powerful to this day, and even aspects of his practical approach were far ahead of their time, and they resonate deeply with some of the leading development thinking today. They inform, I think you could say, an attitude which sees people as protagonists of their own development and focuses building the capacity of individuals. The community can then take into its own hands responsibility for its collective affairs, but that's only possible through consultative action. And key in Abdu'l-Baha's approach to this consultative approach is indeed the role of women. Abdu'l-Baha spoke of men and women as being two wings of a bird, the bird being unable to fly if one wing is weaker. In a patriarchal society, he argued tirelessly for women's rights and exhorted them to recognize that women possess spiritual and intellectual capacities equal to those of men, and that women must contribute fully and equally to their communities if society is to thrive. Abdu'l-Baha's keen sense of social justice and his ability to empathize with the poor and marginalized must have been shaped by his own life experiences. Born on the 23rd of May in 1844 in Tehran, Abdu'l-Baha enjoyed something of a privileged early childhood. His illustrious father, Baha'u'llah, was himself born into a noble family, but had turned his back on his inheritance and devoted his energies to serving the poor and disadvantaged and spreading a message of love, of unity, and of cooperation. These teachings had somehow touched a nerve, touched a chord in a generation who were yearning for renewal and hope, and they attracted a huge following. Principles such as the equality of men and women, the independent pursuit of knowledge, the abolition of the clergy, these were all viewed as revolutionary for their time and so deeply challenging to the establishment that Baha'u'llah and his family and followers became the target of relentless persecution by the monarchy, the clergy, and indeed the government of the day. When Abdu'l-Baha was just 8 years of age, his father was imprisoned and the family's possessions looted, leaving them in absolute poverty. Seeing Baha'u'llah in prison, his hair and beard unkempt, his neck swollen from a heavy steel collar, his body bent by chains, made an indelible impression on the mind of the young Abdu'l-Baha. And this was just the beginning of what was to be 40 years of suffering, including successive exiles and incarcerations at the hands of 2 despotic monarchs. Campaigns to vilify his father's name and condemn his followers, imprisonment, torture, even attempts on his father's life were to follow, all in the vain attempt to stamp out the Baha'i faith that Baha'u'llah had founded. When the family were exiled to Baghdad, they were forced to trek on foot, and the young Abdu'l-Baha suffered frostbite and grieved over the separation from his brother, who was not well enough to make the grueling journey. By his early teens, Abdu'l-Baha had intuitively recognized the station of his father, and over the years became his representative and his secretary, demonstrating a profound knowledge and understanding and a striking mastery of language. Throughout their exiles and imprisonment in the city of Akka, Abdu'l-Baha assumed the burden of various negotiations with civil authorities and increasingly took care of the community of his father's followers. He tended to the sick and the poor. He held his ground on matters of justice with everyone from callous jailers, brutal guards, and hostile officials. But his generosity of spirit, his selfless service, and his adherence to principle became legendary and endeared him to those who came to know him, and in time won over even the most hard-hearted of his enemies. Abdu'l-Baha's life and writings offer a painfully simple and consistent message for us all. He showed us that with an unshakable love for God, we can find an equanimity that no circumstance can shake, and an inner happiness which no adversity can affect. This extraordinary ability to transcend his own suffering and to inspire in others the capacity to do the same is really the subject of this next story.
Does the soul progress more through sorrow than through joy in this world? Someone once asked Abdu'l-Baha. He answered, the mind and spirit of man advance when he is tried by suffering. The more the ground is ploughed, the better the seed will grow. Suffering and tribulation free man from the petty affairs of this worldly life until he arrives at a state of complete detachment. Abdu'l-Baha, of all people, would know. Age 9, he accompanied his father through the rugged mountains of Persia in a bitter cold winter, a prisoner and an exile, traveling from country to country, and finally, many years later, the family arrived in the prison city of Akka. Akka then was a disease-ridden town in Palestine. The air so bad, it was said, that if a bird flew over it, it would drop dead. Abdu'l-Bahá spent the days of his youth in this most dire prison of the Ottoman Empire, suffering penury and cold, hunger and disease. He was mocked and derided. The constant message, you are worthless, worse than worthless, to be shunned for 40 years each day. This had been his reality. Only in old age was he freed to leave and set out on his journeys to America and Europe. This is where we met him in the autumn of 1911, when he was visiting in London and now walking over with us the Serpentine Bridge. He stopped. He watched from the bridge the pearly chain of lights beneath the trees, stretching as far as the eye could see. He loved the light shimmering on the water. I am very much pleased with this scene, he said. There was much darkness in the prison of Akka. Our hearts were sad as we thought of those somber years he had spent in Akka. And when we exclaimed, "Oh, we are glad, we are so glad that you are free," he said, "Freedom is not a matter of place, but of condition." I was happy in that prison, for those days were passed in the path of service. To me, prison was freedom. Therefore, I was full of happiness all through that prison time. Often in his conversations, Abdu'l-Bahá distinguished between the happiness that is connected with the material world, a transitory happiness lasting minutes, hours, days, or months at most, with that eternal, limitless happiness connected with the spiritual, a joy that gives us wings. He told us, when one is released from the prison of self, that is indeed freedom, for self is the greatest prison. These were the thoughts of the prisoner of Akka, divine philosopher from the East, being relayed to us that cool, magical night in London. What was he thinking when, setting out on his travels, released finally after all this time? What does one do and think and feel after so many years? When this prisoner had walked out into the world for the first time in 4 decades, he had not walked out broken, a fragment of a man. He'd walked out triumphant. He'd walked out strong and purposeful. The day he had opened those gates to the world had not been the day that marked his liberation. That prisoner had achieved his liberation and discovered the true meaning of freedom decades earlier, in that very cell, in those very walls, against those chains and storms of prejudice. Because when presented with hatred and contempt, you have a choice. Allow them to define you or transcend them. And he had transcended them. What is this prison of self? Is it not the walls that enclose us all, much firmer than stone and much more subtle? Is it not those chains of memory and wounds and hurt, those things that hold us within the walls of our own inner constraints? And how hard it is to free oneself of these. How hard to forget self. How hard to forgive the unforgivable. Not because it's fair or just, not because the perpetrators deserve such forgiveness or don't, but because of the gift of forgiveness itself. Should any taunt and mock at you, Abdu'l-Bahá wrote, meet him with love. Should any heap his blame upon you, praise ye him. Should he offer you a deadly poison, give him the choicest honey in exchange. And should he threaten your life, grant him a remedy that will heal him evermore. Should he be pain itself, be ye his medicine. Should he be thorns, be ye his roses and sweet herbs. Perchance such ways and words from you will make this darksome world turn bright at last. A story is told of one man back in those years in Akka who bore a particular grudge against Abdu'l-Bahá. To this man, Abdu'l-Bahá was a heretic. He denounced him with bitter words, and whenever he passed by him, he held his robe over his face so as not to see him. Every day, for 24 years, Abdu'l-Bahá was kind to him, giving him of his own food and clothing, caring for him when he was ill. All this he accepted, still holding his cloak over his face. For 24 years, Abdu'l-Bahá continued to show him kindness, while this man persisted in his enmity, until at last, one day, he fell on his knees, weeping. For 24 years, I have done evil to you. For 24 years, you have done good to me. Now I know that I have been wrong. Abdu'l-Bahá bade him rise, and they became friends. This prisoner of Akka, Abdu'l-Bahá, saw in the hatred of his jailers chains much heavier than anything he had to bear, and resolved to be free of them all. And so where there was hatred, he found love. Where there was humiliation, he found dignity. When prejudice and otherness attempted to define him, he found universality and oneness. And when freed from the prison city of Akka, he did not seek rest or repose. He sought service. His was a tree laden with fruit. His soul was a forest in the desert. He had a gift to give, and so he set out, old and physically frail after 40 years in prison. He journeyed, his mission to sow the seeds of love, to connect. All those he met were but his fellow humans. They were all his friends. They were all his family. They were all humanity, each one a mine, rich in gems that he could see. He looked into the eyes of each with open heart, saw into their very souls, uplifted their spirit, and enacted a great transformation in their lives, as he did in ours. So far as ye are able, Abdu'l-Bahá wrote, ignite a candle of love in every meeting, and with tenderness rejoice and cheer ye every heart. Care for the stranger as for one of your own. Show to alien souls the same loving kindness ye bestow upon your faithful friends. That is, rise up in such wise and with such qualities as to endow the body of this world with a living soul, and to bring this young child, humanity, to the stage of adulthood.
Thank you. That's a beautiful story. So amidst all this suffering, we are struck by the authority and power that accompanied Abdu'l-Baha's inexhaustible patience and understanding, by his keenness of wisdom, by this tenderness of personality, and this sort of limitless love that he offered every soul who crossed his path. In any one person's life, these qualities offer an example that seem saintly and almost beyond reach. Yet, in their simplicity and humanity, each of these individual qualities somehow seem attainable and comprehensible somehow for everyone. Yet Abdu'l-Baha never sought praise or worldly recognition. Above all, it was his perfection of the practice of servitude and the elevation of its station that leaves the strongest mark on our hearts. A child once asked him, why all the rivers flow into the ocean? And Abdu'l-Baha said, because the ocean sets itself lower than them all, and so draws the rivers to them, draws the rivers to itself. Now, this model of what we might call today servant leadership has profound importance, and it impacts on the kind of grassroots change that society so desperately needs, and that is the prerequisite and indeed the foundation for the kind of systemic societal change that we recognize that's needed. On the 29th of May in 1892, Abdu'l-Baha's father, Baha'u'llah, passed away. And in his will, he appointed Abdu'l-Baha as his successor, as the head of the Baha'i faith and the leader of the global community now of its followers. In this capacity, Abdu'l-Baha was able to preserve the integrity of his father's teachings and ensure the harmony and unity of a growing and diverse Baha'i community, a feat without precedent in religious history. At the age of 70, Abdu'l-Baha set out on a series of journeys, which took him to Egypt, Canada, America, Hungary, France, and other countries in Europe, and allowed him to visit cities including London, Oxford, Bristol, and Manchester in his travels in this country. On the 10th of September, 1911, from the pulpit of the City Temple Church in London, Abdu'l-Baha gave a public address for the first time in his life. His travels to the West were filled with ceaseless activity in public talks, in meetings with the press, interviews with individuals. In each of these, he applied his father's teachings to the contemporary issues and the problems facing humanity. On both continents, he received a highly appreciative welcome from extraordinarily distinguished audiences who were concerned about the condition of modern society. They were devoted to such concerns as the issues of peace, women's rights, racial equality, social reform, and fundamental moral development. Abdu'l-Baha spoke at several universities during his travels. When he was invited to speak at Stanford by the president of the university, all the classes were cancelled for the first and only time in the history of the institution, so that all 2,000 students and staff could attend. Abdu'l-Baha's approach in his talks and in his writings was at once mystical and scientific, with rational proofs and logical exposition. He spoke of human nature, the meaning of freedom, and many of the foremost philosophical questions of life. He demonstrated the coherence of heart and mind and the inherent harmony between science and religion. Now, I want to bring another storyteller in now, and let's hear more about these travels and some of the people Abdu'l-Baha met, and indeed some of the lives that he touched.
After 40 long years in prison, Abdu'l-Bahá could at last bring his message out into the open air. He wanted to travel to the West to bring the Baha'i teachings of peace and unity to the people there. With his very un-Western name and his Oriental dress, he was certainly a curiosity at the time, but every nation took him seriously. Newspaper reporters followed him everywhere, and there were headlines such as "Persian preacher in flowing robes calls for unity," and "World peace urged by Abdu'l-Bahá." Those who gathered to hear him speak were from every strata of society, from princes to paupers. There were politicians and professors, playwrights, poets and painters. There were suffragettes, socialists, society ladies, lords, ladies and labourers, lawyers, dressmakers and dowagers, ministers, missionaries and merchants. They gathered in homes and hotels, in mansion halls, in mosques, churches, clubs, societies and synagogues. Abdu'l-Bahá spoke wherever he could. He spoke in public squares, in parks, in homeless shelters, in railway carriages, even ocean liners. Well, I'd like to tell you two stories that took place in London, two very different audiences and two very different places. The first occasion was grand, the home of Sir Richard and Lady Stately in Bloomsbury Square. Sir Richard had made his fortune in clothing manufacture, Stately and Smith, but he was a philanthropist. He sponsored impoverished young people to attend university. He moved in the upper echelons of society among prominent men and women, and he introduced Abdu'l-Bahá to his circle on different occasions. Well, on this particular evening, he and his wife hosted a reception in their home in honor of Abdu'l-Bahá. Now, on his travels, Abdu'l-Bahá brought with him some Persian gentlemen to act as secretaries. They accompanied him and they translated his words, and of course, they were all devoted to him. That night, a number of guests were traveling in the car to the reception at the Stately's, but there was no room left for Abdu'l-Bahá's secretary. He had to stay behind. However, when everyone arrived at the Stately's home, to their great surprise, there he was. He had been so bereft at the thought of leaving Abdu'l-Bahá for even one evening that at the very last minute, he had leapt onto the roof of the car. Well, one can only imagine the extraordinary sight as this car sped through London's smartest streets from Chelsea to Bloomsbury, with an Oriental man in full robes and turban clinging determinedly to the roof. Just imagine the Stately's beautiful Edwardian townhouse, lit up for the evening with candles and chandeliers, decorated lavishly with flowers and fruit and finery. And there were all the great and the good of London, all dressed up in evening dress. And in Abdu'l-Bahá's honor, a cake had been baked, a large iced cake with flock of snow white doves radiating from it. Well, Abdu'l-Bahá broke off the icing doves and gave them to people as a souvenir. And then he spoke. He described how thoughts of love would spread like doves of peace, scattering over the land. He would often say to an audience, "I charge you all that each one of you concentrate all the thoughts of your heart on love and unity. When a thought of war comes, oppose it with a stronger thought of peace. A thought of hatred must be overcome by a more powerful thought of love." Abdu'l-Bahá often spoke about the peace process beginning at the individual level, peace emerging from an inner state. His vision was the development of a unity of consciousness amongst the people of the world. because, he knew that peace would never be achieved by words, by proclamations or theories, but it involved the practice of spiritual ideals. Such ideals were enshrined in his father's teachings. These ideals, such as equality between men and women, the elimination of prejudice of all kinds, the removal of extremes of wealth and poverty, would conquer barriers to peace. He encouraged people to serve others, to strengthen bonds of friendship, and become a constructive force for good in the world. And his words, of course, were reflected by his own actions. He brought diverse people together. He always sought out oppressed minorities. He showed them the utmost love and friendship. And breaking with the conventions of the time, he made sure that every meeting was open to all, no matter what race or culture or religion. So, what did people think? How were they affected? Well, surely they were affected by the loving presence of Abdu'l-Baha, his ability to answer the questions of the heart. If you had been there that night, if you had moved in circles such as the Stapleys hosted, you would have heard talk of Abdu'l-Baha from the prominent people of the time, the influencers, the artists, the thinkers. You might have heard Khalil Gibran say of him, "I must tell you that Abdu'l-Baha is a very great man. He is complete. There are worlds in his soul. And oh, what a remarkable face. What a beautiful face. So real and so sweet." Or perhaps you would have heard the Japanese poet Yone Noguchi say, "His words are as simple as sunlight. And again, like the sunlight, they are universal. No teacher, I think, has been more important today than Abdu'l-Baha." Although he moved throughout society, Abdu'l-Baha was especially sympathetic to the poor and the downtrodden. Having been imprisoned himself with so little for so long, he actively sought them out and sought out those marginalized communities as well. So on Christmas Day, he visited a Salvation Army shelter, a very different environment to the Stapleys' glittering reception. 1,000 homeless men were being treated to a Christmas dinner at the shelter, and they rose to greet him as he came into the room. Abdu'l-Baha spoke of his pleasure at being present at such a gathering. "My lot has ever been with those who have not the goods of this world," he said. And he reminded them how all the prophets of God have been poor. Christ was poor, and his followers were among the very poorest of society. Moses was poor, and he was a shepherd. Baha'u'llah was imprisoned and in poverty. "The great ones of the world have come from a lowly station," he said. "Be ever happy, be not sad. The poor have ever been humble, their hearts are humble. The rich are not so." Well, many of the men there were so taken by his presence that they forgot to eat the food that was put in front of them. They allowed it to go cool as they listened attentively. Abdu'l-Baha had given a sum of money to the shelter, and he meant this to be distributed among those present. But the Salvation Army captain had a different idea. He suggested that another dinner be hosted for the men present, a dinner on New Year's Eve. And as the captain announced this to the men, they rose again, applauding him, and they waved their knives and forks in the air for several minutes. Abdu'l-Baha loved people for the spirit within them, not for any fame or fortune that they happened to possess. That love radiated from him always to every soul. As one of his secretaries at the time said, "With no army, he fights, and his victories are successive. With no help, he works, and the fruits of his labor are abundant. Nations listen to his counsel, people heed his words. His weapon is the love of God.
Lovely. So during these travels, Abdu'l-Baha spoke of the need to create the social conditions and the international political instruments necessary to establish peace. But he was far from naive about the possibility of war, and he repeatedly warned of the dangers of a world encircling conflict. On one occasion, he said, all the wars which have taken place since the inception of humanity, since the inception of human history, have emanated either from religious prejudice, racial prejudice, patriotic prejudice, or political greed and interest. As long as these prejudices last, so long will the foundation of humanity tremble. When such prejudices pass away, the world will at last find peace. So all prejudice was to be rejected because it hampered the processes of both individual and collective peace. Although he was a deeply spiritual and indeed religious man, he had personally witnessed the great evils perpetrated in the name of religion and understood the ways in which it had been a source of conflict throughout the ages. He went as far on one occasion as to say that if religion should prove to be the cause of enmity and hatred instead of love, its absence is preferable to its existence. But he also spoke of the underlying message of love as the thread connecting all religions when they were freed from superstition and tradition. He described religion's capacity to bind disparate elements of society together in the service of noble goals. And he spoke of religion at its best as the motive force in the advancement of civilization. Less than 2 years later, his premonitions of a world encircling conflict became a reality as the horrors of the First World War erupted. But his tireless work for peace continued, grounded in an unshakable conviction that the long-promised time for the unification of humanity had indeed come. In the midst of war, a worldwide pandemic, closed borders, and shifting national alliances, conditions that sound all too familiar today. He penned a series of letters to the international organization in The Hague, which had brought together delegates from 40 nations to attempt to establish a durable peace. Many of these delegates would later be involved in forming the League of Nations, an institution, of course, that was in some sense the forerunner to the United Nations. And he called on them to overlook their petty differences in service of peace, in service of a peace the world needed so desperately. In his letters, he explained that any holistic approach to global peace compels humanity to create new institutions with the capacity to function at a global level. He argued that the world had irreversibly become an interdependent place, necessitating an interwoven, international, and indeed multilateral approach to peace and security. However, at the same time, he also wrote that the fundamental responsibility for peace lay with each and every person on the planet. Peace must first be established among individuals until it leads in the end to peace among nations. Or to put it another way, the well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. And he called on every individual to work towards this goal. We must strive, he said, with all our might and forsaking our own advantage, rest and comfort, forego the pursuit of our own endeavors, devote ourselves to this mighty cause of peace. And indeed, his whole life and work were a perfect expression of this principle. He worked to unite individual hearts to build a world in which each one of us can be seen as the fruits of one tree, the flowers of one garden, the leaves of one branch, the drops of one ocean, the waves of one sea, members of one family. Abdu'l-Baha passed away at the age of 77 on the 28th of November, 1921. So what lessons can we draw from such a life? His legacy and the most visible expression of his principles is indeed the worldwide Baha'i community present in every country and region of the planet, who remain united in their vast diversity of race, culture, religion, philosophical outlook. And this community has grown now to number millions. To this day, they follow Abdu'l-Baha's example, working together with all of humanity to transform this darksome world into one of peace and justice. But I find that his life is also a challenge to us today. It's a challenge to sustain the belief in the fundamental goodness of humanity that he demonstrated. A challenge to take up the cause of peace in our own time that he championed in his. To emulate the example of servitude and humility that he gave us, and indeed to study the body of his writings and benefit from these timeless insights they continue to offer. Thank you for listening to us and for joining us for this session this evening. We don't have a lot of time, and we have got some questions in the Q&A, but I've also been asked to briefly share with you a few photographs, a few images of Abdu'l-Baha, just to bring some of these stories, beautiful stories that you've been hearing, to life. And so if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to try as seamlessly as possible to do that. I hope that this will work as it should. I wonder if someone can tell me if, yeah, so I hope that now we can see these images. This is an image of Abdu'l-Baha as a young man with his young brother, who was referred to in one of the stories. This is an image of Abdu'l-Baha later in his life, but it reminds us of how simple this life was, a horse-drawn carriage on the beach, indeed, between Haifa and Akka. This is an image of Abdu'l-Baha receiving his knighthood, as was related in one of the stories. This is Abdu'l-Baha, of course, need no explanation as to where this is, at the foot of the Eiffel Tower, during these momentous journeys to the west, these travels to the west that we referred to. And here is an image, a colorized image of Abdu'l-Baha in later life, just to give you a sense of who he was. So I'll hand back to Zinzan now, I think, and we'll take it from there.
My warmest thanks to Sean for this really moving evening, and also to Tebi, Ian, and Sarah for their captivating storytelling, painting this portrait of Abdu'l-Baha, blending these different facets of philosopher, mystic, social reformer, promulgator of peace, and into this one mosaic. So we just have a couple of minutes, not too many, for questions. Maybe also, yeah, sorry, I just realized that maybe we can even see, I think Ian and Sarah, they're with us on the Zoom. Maybe they can show their videos so we can see them and really thank them for their really captivating and beautiful storytelling. Unfortunately, Tebi is not there, but we can also remember her. Thank you so much. And so, yeah, maybe these three, they'll have a chance to answer a couple of questions. So if you could all submit your questions via the Q&A feature. So if you see in the bottom of your screen, there's a place to click on Q&A. The questions will just be visible to our speakers here, and Sean, together with Ian and Sarah, will try and answer as many of them as possible. And just one question that's come before we go ahead.
I was going to say, so we've got someone asked a question about some of the arrangements, about how this how would somebody indeed, sort of practically, how would such a journey be possible? And I don't know whether Sarah or Ian, you want to comment on this, but I think the thing I want to mention is that, we talked in the talk, we talked about Abdu'l-Baha's approach being both one which was deeply individual, resting on the transformation and indeed the extraordinary potential he saw in each and every one of us as individuals, but also the sort of importance of change beginning in the heart of an individual. And at the same time, his vision of the need for institutions and for organization and administration to translate those individual insights, those individual actions into the kind of systemic change that's required. And so, that insight into how change happens in the world was very, very evident in the way in which he led the Baha'i community and in the way in which the Baha'i community around the world had developed. And so, in addition to there being a community of individuals around the world who knew him, who'd visited him, and these included some of the most prominent people of the day, the wife of, William Randolph Hearst, one of the great media magnates. Some of these extraordinary individuals had traveled all the way to Abdu'l-Baha in the Holy Land to visit him, and prior to these visits to the West. And so there were many individuals who hosted and welcomed him and were there to make arrangements. But there was also a Baha'i community in each of these countries that was organized, that had institutions, that had elected councils and an organization that was able to participate and prepare the way and make arrangements and organize things along the way. So I think as a sort of general answer to that question, I would say it was this visit to the West was organized both through individuals and also through organizations and institutions. It was a sort of marriage of both of those, which seems very fitting as it was such a core principle. There's a question here which I might pass to Sarah and Ian, and may even be the last we get to touch on, which is to give us an idea of some of the social issues that Abdu'l-Baha addressed. We've had some stories, but I wonder if there's any others any other sort of key social issues that you think that Abdu'l-Baha addressed that are sort of germane, especially today.
Well, possibly, as you mentioned before, Sean, the rights of women. He really championed the rights of women, and he was very encouraging to women. He really loved to see women who were courageous, who spoke out, who followed their convictions. And there were many women of the time who, it was the suffragette movement, of course, was very, very prominent then, who he spoke to and encouraged and said, very soon women will take their rightful place in the world. And he was such a promoter of the equality between men and women. But of course, he encouraged them when he spoke to various suffragettes, very well-known ones as well. He really encouraged them to pursue their goals through peaceful means. So I think that is still appropriate today.
It's wonderful. Ian, any thoughts?
No, I share what Sarah says. I think for me, a very powerful stance that Abdu'l-Baha took, particularly in America, was on racism. And it is well worth looking at where he just literally challenged the social conventions and the accepted norms in the most, sort of calm way. But the courage is startling. And obviously the story of Louis Gregory in America, where he got this black man to come and sit beside him and really somewhat scandalized the sort of the social milieu of the gathering. And It's really an extraordinary how he does it, and how he does it to sort of obviously more than make the point, but done with a kind of not any sense of condemnation, but that this is the most natural thing in the world. And he expresses surprise that Louis Gregory hasn't been able to join the table in the same way as everybody else. So, and there are many other stories, but I think that is still, still resonates very powerfully.
And so true. And I think that's probably a lovely place to end. And Zinzan, I'll hand back to you, and thank you to Sarah and Ian, and thank you to everybody for joining us this evening.
Yeah, just to extend even more thanks. Yeah, Sean, Ian, Sarah, and of course, Tevi, thank you for giving us such illuminating insights, just a peek, a glimpse into the life of this extraordinary individual. And thank you to the audience, really, for all your questions. If we didn't get to yours, please feel free to be in touch with the Cambridge University Baha'i Society. We can follow up on that. Or if you have more questions that come up, we'll leave these contact details maybe in the chat, or we'll have a slide with them at the very end. One question that came up again and again was, is there a recording? Yes, so the whole talk was recorded, and it will be made available on our YouTube page. If you look up Cambridge University Baha'i Society, you'll find our YouTube page, and it'll be posted in the coming days if you wish to watch it or share it with others. So that brings to a close our event tonight. Thank you all. We hope to see you next week for our second event, which is on climate change as part of the Cambridge Festival, and organized by the Cambridge University Baha'i Society again. So that's next Thursday. I think all that's left to say is thank you all for joining, and have a lovely evening.